Why are Smurf accounts not IP banned and reported? And if they're giving death threats and racial slurs, why aren't they reported to the police? I don't have any details on like why or why not players are or would not be reported to the police. Like, I'm sure that's like a complicated subject in terms of like video game companies monitoring their game and like what are actual dangerous threats, things like that. So I can't really speak to that. I will say that the idea of IP bans is difficult because there's a lot of situations where different players play on similar IPs. And so it's hard to just necessarily IP ban a player. Hardware banning is a different story. And, you know, personally, it feels like it makes sense to me that like if someone's being nasty enough and they're using Smurf accounts to dodge punishments, that if we can detect those Smurf accounts, we'd also ban their Smurfs when we ban their main. If they're like using Smurf accounts to dodge, that seems like would be a good way to moderate, but I'm not on the moderation team. I don't really know how that stuff works perfectly. But I do know that IP bans are not like this magical solution like you think they would be, given like some of the complexities. Was like, you know, what if like 4 or 5 different people playing the same IP, things like that. As far as I understand, IP bans are not really all that effective of a solution for like preventing someone from smurfing, given their like the outcomes, that the other potential outcomes. Yeah. If we were to like expand that, something you really need to think about in game design in regards to especially things like moderation, is the potential negative outcomes of the things you're doing. And so a lot of like the general idea of a lot of moderation starts in very good places. Like, as an example, hey, if there's a player in my game who is trolling, I should be able to vote to kick them, and we should all be able to vote to kick them out, and then if 4 people vote to kick that person out, they are booted from the game for being a horrible person, they lose MMR, and none of us do, right? That's like a very common suggestion, as an example, is we need to be able to vote kick in-game because it would help us deal with awful trolls and not punish the people getting trolled. And quite honestly, sounds like a great solution on its head, right? Like not on its head, but you know, up front, right? But there's a lot of potential problems with that solution. And so like one of the problems is like you have to think about, well, how could this be used in a bad way or a negative way? So as an example, if you're able to vote kick people, will that sometimes be used to stop trolls? 100%, and that's like a great outcome. But for every time it's used to stop trolls, there might be another time where it's like, oh, there's a bunch of players who determined that somebody on their team is different than them in some way, and therefore decides to vote kick. One of the common things that can happen in certain Counter-Strike lobbies is if your teammates find out you're a woman, they might vote kick you. This has happened to some of my friends in the past. Another thing that could happen is, what if players vote kick a person who went 0-5, who legitimately isn't trolling, who legitimately is trying their best, and people are just like, we're going to lose the game, this person needs to be vote kicked so that we don't lose MMR, right? And so it's a thing where, well, vote kick could have a lot of like really good outcomes for letting players protect themselves against trolls. There's actually a bunch of very negative outcomes that come with it in terms of its potential for abuse against in other things, and that's like something you really have to consider. And so one of the complexities of designing moderation systems and just a lot of systems in game design in general is you always have to consider, okay, even if the upfront idea is really good and causes some good results, what are the potential abuse cases? Excuse me. What are the potential negatives? What are the potential bad results of that thing? And like, you really, really need to consider those when you're making something, because I'm telling you right now, especially in big games, like if players find ways to abuse something, they're going to do it. Not all of them, of course, but like if there are abuse cases, there's going to be some section of your community who does those abuse cases, and you gotta make sure it's like either A, they don't happen, or B, if they do happen, they're infrequent enough or acceptable enough, or things like that. Like there's definitely costs. Why don't we get to reset an account's MMR on our own to prevent smurfing? So Sazin, that's a great question, and I would encourage you to, based on what I just said, think about a possible answer for it. So I was just talking about how think about the abuse cases and the downsides with any like cool, potentially cool system. And so potentially cool system, Smurfs smurf because they think their MMR is broken, and so they need to reset it. Okay, so the solution will be that let's just let them reset their account's MMR. What are the potential negative outcomes of just letting players do that? Right? It's like, should we let everybody who loses their placements reset their MMR? Should we let iron players reset their MMR because they're like, no, I deserve to be in diamond, so I'm going to reset my MMR, and now I'm going to be back in like silver, and then I'm going to fall to iron again, things like that. Should we legitimately, should we let diamond players reset their MMR so that they're like, actually, I feel like I just don't want to be diamond, but I do want to stomp people, and so I'll reset my MMR. I know like what actually happens is they just make a smurf, right? But like, and so there's definitely complexities and potential negative results from a system like that. And that's something you have to consider based on, yes, here's a good thing, but what are all the potential bad things for it? One of the things that's really, really important to think about in League of Legends is League of Legends is a significantly worse game when the teams are mismatched. League of Legends is a game that tends to rely very heavily on matchmaking to ensure that games are good. When like teams are like very, very, very deeply mismatched, those games are going to feel fairly bad to play in a lot of situations, especially in ranked. And like, I mean, people talk about that all the time, right? It's like this game felt uneven and that was a bad time, right? And so if you have a system that's like allowing people to constantly move to where they technically aren't supposed to be, that can potentially create some fairly bad outcomes for just game quality overall and stuff like that. So there's always things to think about. This is one of the reasons that like we don't necessarily always do full resets to MMR. Like sometimes people will be like, why don't you just fully reset MMR in a new season? And one of the dangers of doing that is that's going to mean that at the start of a new season, if the games are going to be very, very low quality because a lot of people just won't be matched correctly. And so soft resets tend to still give people that, fresh start that they're looking for without necessarily being like we're pairing a challenger player against a silver player, which could have some very rough outcomes. I love the Halloween costume. Great work. Oh, thank you. It's hard being a doctor, especially when you have 5 other jobs, but I'm doing my best. What's my opinion on smurfing in general? My summary of opinion on smurfing in general is I'm not sure that the solution of like just ban all Smurfs is correct. I know Dota did that, and there's definitely some great outcomes from that, where it's like, hey, games are much more likely to be even, and you don't have people like necessarily like dodging bans or breaking MMR or things like that. Like, so there's some very like real positive outcomes to banning all Smurfs. Assuming you can detect them. The 2 biggest difficulties I'd say with banning Smurfs that I think creates some, potentially real issues is one is when people want to like play different things that they're not top tier at. So as an example, for me, I'm a diamond player. I play support. I am not a diamond level top laner. And so if I wasn't able to have a Smurf, there's probably would be no way for me to actually play top lane. Aside from ruining many, many, many games in diamond would be like the answer. It's like, okay, well, I will just lose a bunch of games and troll my teammates in top lane in diamond because I can't smurf it until I get there. Whereas like right now what I do is if I want to play top or bottom, which roles I'm not very good at, I don't play them on my main unless I get auto filled there or second rolled, and instead I play, like on a smurf. And I have a smurf account that's like a gold level top laner, or at least it used to be. I don't know if it's that good anymore. So that's one of the challenges is like, how do people play things that they're not top tier at? If they can't smurf, that's like a thing to think about. Another thing to think about that I think is very difficult is how do players play with friends of different skill levels? Like if you have a new friend who's going to play League of Legends, it can be a very, very bad experience if you play on, and let's say you're challenger or something, it can be a very, very bad experience if you play with them on your challenger account. If you just have a group of friends that's across different MMRs, it's just generally rough in League and games like it to be able to play with friends of varying skill levels. And so one of the ways players adjust for that is by being like, well, instead of being on my challenger account, I'll be on my diamond account, and that won't make as insane games. And so without Smurfs, like that's another thing, is like it becomes harder to play with your friends, which is a pretty rough outcome given how social of a game League of Legends is, or has the potential to be. And so, well, I think there's definitely a lot of negative outcomes of smurfing that definitely just suck, like ban dodging and people who just smurf to troll up low MMR players and beat up on low MMR players. Like, ideally, if people are doing that, we'd have ways to ban them or something like that. There's definitely, I think, positive outcomes of it as well that I don't know if just straight up removing smurfs would definitely necessarily make the game, overall way better.